it was the police. It was he himself. He just couldn't remember doing it. And all the time, people kind of... you can hear his laughter in his own kind of absurdity. That's what makes him great, I think, is that he keeps an element of reflexivity about just how cliched he's being as a kind of fried Californian hippie.
And that's all through his work as well, isn't it? One of the things that marks out his work as well as the great ideas and the extraordinary obsessive nature of his thoughts and his thinking is also the humour. It's got a great sense of humour. There is an absurdity to it which sort of marks it out from maybe some slightly more po-faced science fiction that there is around, much more serious in quotation
Exactly.
marks.
This is a future where you can't open the door because you don't have enough money to kind of get the door to open. You have an argument with the door that's going to threaten to sue you because you're not paying it to open and so on. It's hilarious stuff.
It's hilarious and it's slightly mad. And I just want to talk a little bit about the madness, the mental illness, which you obviously understand, Michael. On the other hand, you strike me as a rather balanced sort of person.
More and more now, people are more open about the fact that they have either experienced directly or indirectly through family members and friends some form of mental illness. And sometimes because of traumatic events, the mind adapts around something that needs to keep a room locked inside your psyche. Shakespeare describes it in Hamlet as a vicious mole in nature that's within them, I say. So oft it chances in particular men that for some vicious mole of nature in them, oft breaking down the pales and forts of reason, or by some habit that too much o'erleavens the form of plausive manners, that these men, carrying, I say, the stamp of one defect, his virtues else, be they as pure as grace, as infinite as men may undergo, shall in the general censure take corruption from that particular fault. And then very soon the ghost appears. And I believe that is Shakespeare talking about what many, many, many centuries later Jung and Freud talked about, the idea that there is something that is just cut off from us in our experience, in our psyche, some traumatic wound that has to be defended and protected, and the psyche builds up a form, a belief system, a way of perceiving reality that takes account of protecting this wound. But the problem is, as you grow up and as you get older, there is another reality behind that you haven't created, that is just objectively real. And the interplay between those two things can create all kinds of anomalies that, if you're not careful, can drive you, for want of a better word, mad. And that was one of those things that happened in Dick's life.
And it did drive him pretty crazy towards the end. There was the point at which he had a kind of split of his personalities, wasn't there, Roger? He thought he was two people. Or...
He wrote a novel called Varlis about his religious experience, which is about Philip.K. Dick and another version of Philip.K. Dick, which is a literal translation of his name, Horse Lover, Philip from the Greek, and Dick in German means fat. So he had a character called Horse Lover Fat and Philip.K. Dick, who are the same person, essentially. But they're kind of berating each other about the absurdity of their vision. The striking thing, I think, about him in relation to psychiatry is, again, this is an era where people are incredibly self-conscious about mental illness, and he's striking at how often he diagnoses himself in different terms. So he got very interested in schizophrenia in the 60s. But that was also a time of anti-psychiatry when the schizophrenic could be seen as a great shamanic figure, someone who had an access to truth and so on. He was ironically got hooked on amphetamines because he was given those by a psychiatrist for anxiety and for his agoraphobia. He couldn't leave his house for many years. So he's someone who is... He's constantly self-diagnosing.
He couldn't leave his house for many years.
Yeah.
And and this is the thing. In some ways, it's quite easy, I would imagine, for a lot of people to sort of just go, well, he was just someone who was on a lot of drugs and came up with these crazy ideas.
Yeah.
But there is an area that I think someone like Philip.K. Dick, who was clearly on some kind of a quest, a search. There was a point to what he was doing. He was moving in a particular direction, and he had the ability to be incredibly self-aware in amongst this madness. And out of that came work that is of real value.
Here's a clip of him in 1976 explaining the plot to his novel A Scanner Darkly.
It's a story about a guy who becomes a narcotics agent and then begins to narc on himself. He rigs up a scanner, an infrared scanner in his own home. And while he's in the home, he feels he's being watched. And then when he goes, to the safe house, he watches reels and reels of tape, video, hologram tape, it's set in the future, of what he was doing in the house. And he's so spaced out by the dope he's been taking as an undercover agent that he doesn't know he's narking on himself. He thinks he's two different guys. And when his superiors point out to him that he's really the same guy that he's been reporting on, he flies into a terrible rage, and they fire him. and then he's got to come off the dope because he can't afford to buy it anymore because he doesn't have any more money, and his brain is all burned out.
You could just say this is just a poor guy who was not very well, that there have probably been countless people who suffered the same sorts of mental torments, the splits, the feelings of unreality that he suffered, and we would simply call them tall tales and say that the chap or the woman was ill. In his case, because he was a very talented writer, we take it all very seriously, and we try to analyse what he meant. Maybe it was all just nonsense.
Well, then everything that Baudrillard, the French philosopher, is nonsense. Everything, the popularity of things like The Matrix, and part of what I think touched a nerve in the world with The Matrix was because it was dealing with the idea of simulacra and simulacrum, the idea that the world is turning into a theme park of itself. What is an authentic experience now? Where can you go to have an authentic experience? It's the whole of our culture, the whole of our lives, in fact, are being taken over by the idea of you don't have an experience, you have a sort of a version of that experience, a kind of filtered down, dissipated version of that experience, so that our lives are becoming theme parks of lives rather than actual lives. And this is what Dick was writing about and experiencing, and somehow able to turn into accessible, incredibly rich, complex work. And I think since he was writing and since he died, more and more and more our culture is turning towards everything that he was obsessed
Yeah, certainly
about.
The mental illness was not just a sort of white noise to his talent, it was part of the talent, part of what he was.
I think it allowed him to see certain things in his time
Yeah.
which otherwise he wouldn't have seen. And that's why political philosophers are so interested in Philip Dick, actually, because it does suggest that actually he's one of the first people to be able to see through this kind of shiny consumerist world into the kind of rotting chaos behind it. And there is an extraordinary kind of sense of vision with that.
In 1982 he suffered a stroke, he never fully recovered, died in the same year, the very year that Blade Runner was released. From what you've just been saying, Michael, I wonder whether you might momentarily think that Philip.K. Dick had been right and that we are actually living in a Phil Dickian world, that he wasn't mad.
I think that he was a casualty of many things, partly of his time. I mean, obviously the drugs, taking handfuls of amphetamines is not going to necessarily help you have a pleasant, calm, easygoing life. But I think what was extraordinary about him was that he had a mind that was able to be self-aware to a huge extent whilst going on an incredibly terrifying but also revelatory journey, and that the reports that came back from that journey that he went on are there for all of us to benefit from if we're interested in going on a similar journey. We don't necessarily have to be a casualty in the same way, but there are huge riches for us to take from that.
If he were with us now in the studio, and who knows, if his own theories are right, he may well be, would you advise him to live his life differently from the way he lived it? That the genius, in a sense, wrecked. Is the wreckage necessary?
I don't know if it is. If we live in a Newtonian universe and it was all cause and effect, then you'd say, well, he had nothing, there's no other alternative. He couldn't be. In a quantum universe, there are many, many Philip.K. Dicks with many, many different lives, and we can hopefully benefit from all of them in different ways. So I would just thank him for what he created and was able to leave behind out of that very difficult, intense, obsessive journey he went on.
Well, my thanks to one of the many, many Michael Sheens for championing the life of Philip.K. Dick, and to Roger Luckhurst for being our expert witness. Goodbye.